Hi, welcome back to the AI Wave podcast. I'm your host, Chris Parisi, and today we have Sam Saarinen. So he has his doctorate from Brown University in applied AI. He has a book that's called Education in the Next 100 Years, founder and CEO of Edapt Technologies, and has a really cool product called Quizius that just launched. And I learned a lot listening to Sam. I know you will. There's a ton of nuggets of educational information that you're going to want to learn, such as how can we apply this to the AI task force, and what does the future of education look like, and what's the psychology behind learning, and how can we apply that to AI technology. It was great. I hope you enjoy it. So stay tuned and continue to ride the AI wave. Hi and welcome. I'm Chris Parisi, host of the AI Wave podcast, and today we have Sam Saarinen. Sam has a doctorate from Brown University, which was applying AI to education. And you recently have a book called Education the Next 100 Years.
That's correct.
Well, that's very cool because this is our AI plus education series, and we're so glad to have you on here, Sam.
Glad to be here.
So Sam, tell our audience a little bit more about yourself. First off, I heard you're not a Rhode Islander. You're not from here, but were you born or from Kentucky?
Yeah, so I grew up in Kentucky, moved there when I was 3.5, was born in Ohio. My family's from all over. Moved up here to Rhode Island about 8 years ago for grad school, and then have stayed since graduating.
All right, cool. And tell our audience, what's one thing about you that they probably don't know about?
For a brief moment, I actually considered a career in rap. Not that I'm amazing, but I have a specialty in writing raps about technical topics. So there's a little bit of a niche there.
Oh, that's cool. Is any of your work out there? Could I check it out?
So there's a couple of clips on YouTube of me rapping at my thesis defense, and
I gotta check this out afterwards.
Yeah, rapping
maybe we'll
about
put it in
companies.
the show notes, Jack. That's cool. That's cool. Well, it's great to have you here, and you are someone that is not just knowledgeable of when it comes to AI and education, but have been applying it, and it's kind of like what your life's work at these days. And when it comes to AI, there's been this latest buzz around LLMs, right? But AI's been around for decades, especially when it comes to machine learning and deep learning. Tell us a little bit, educate our audience, what is the difference, and how are those subsets part of AI?
Yeah, absolutely. So AI research actually goes back close to 75 years now. And in the early days, artificial intelligence was really more of an aspirational title than it was a description of anything technical. That's happened over and over again in the research community. So like machine learning, deep learning, artificial neural networks, they're all a little bit suggestive of what's happening, but without a technical understanding, it's easy to think that they're kind of more general or more sophisticated than they are. Not to say we haven't made amazing progress, but I think what's happened is with ChatGPT, large language models and machine learning in general really entered the public consciousness in a new way. Before, it was happening a lot under the scenes. You've got Google Maps finding you optimal routes. No one thinks of that as AI, even though that's building on these classical algorithms. So the way I like to think about it is that AI is kind of like an onion, right? So you've got this big circle, which is artificial intelligence research, which is really just trying to solve problems automatically. And anything that fits in that umbrella could be considered artificial intelligence. And then a really big subsection of that onion is something called machine learning. And basically, it's applying statistics at a really big scale. So we take a ton of data, we collect a ton of statistics, and try to use that to make informed decisions. There's a lot of nuance that I'm glossing over. Recently, say last 20 years, most of the major advances have been due to the use of something called artificial neural networks, which sound like they're based on brains, but it's probably more accurate to think of them as just really complicated mathematical functions. And there's a specific variant of artificial neural networks called deep neural networks, which just means that the signals have to go through more layers of processing before they get used. Basically, all of the breakthroughs in the last 5 years have been using some form of deep learning. It's almost like non-informative now to say that you're using deep learning if you're working in machine learning or even AI. And then large language models are kind of a really recent breakthrough around language processing using a specific architecture called the transformer architecture, which is a form of deep learning, which are a form of artificial neural network, which is a form of machine learning, which is a form of AI.
Well said. There's a lot of layers to that onion. And one of the things, obviously, we've been talking about is LLMs, but the machine learning and deep learning, and how can you apply that to education? So you have a diverse journey in education, originally an educator, and then you decide to pivot, right, and launch Quizius to kind of where we are today. Would you say that's kind of your accurate journey? And what drove you to go from teaching to a consulting company?
Yeah, I would say it's a little bit more complicated than that. In that when I was younger, I didn't know how to say no to things. So the technology has always been a part of my life. As an undergrad, I studied computer science, math, and physics. In grad school, I studied computer science. I've done teaching on the side for a long time, since I finished high school. I really think that education has this unique leverage to move the world forward. I care a lot about reducing global poverty, and there's a lot of infrastructural and engineering problems to solve. I don't know how to solve those. I happen to be decent at teaching. I know a little bit about education, and I know a somewhat more substantial amount about machine learning. And so this was kind of me thinking, how can I have the biggest positive impact? It's probably by applying these technologies to making high quality education more scalable.
And I guess that's what the drive is that you talk about how can we reduce poverty, how can we, increase education access. Is that what was the driver for where you are today?
Yeah, I would like to think that my career has been a very deliberate attempt to maximize the good that I'm doing. But in practice, there's a lot of tactical decisions that have been in response to me realizing how naive I was. When I started on this, I was like, building a company can't be that hard. And I'm sure you know, Chris, that it is always harder than it seems on the outset. So many things to figure out. And so my work right now is actually much more niche than where I'd eventually like to be working. We're very specifically focused on helping students to develop good study habits, and we're concentrating specifically on professional degrees like law, where there's a large amount of content that has to be memorized. In 5 years, I'd love to have this conversation and be talking about, work in an industrializing country, doing public education, but that's just not where the company's at right now.
So tell us a little bit more about where the company is at right now. Is this Quizius that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's right. So maybe 4 or 5 months ago, we decided to make a very deliberate pivot to a narrower product offering, and that is Quizius. Quizius is building on some research I did in grad school around optimizing adaptive assessment. So that is choosing which questions to ask based on the information we've already gotten in order to maximize how much we're learning. We want to minimize the amount of time students spend actually taking tests relative to the amount of detail we learn about them. And then on the side, I'd also done some work on modeling human memory, tracking how people forget things, when they forget them. If we have those pieces kind of combined, we can build some very efficient tools for helping students to study, which is kind of an ideal use case for machine learning, because it's tedious for humans to create these kinds of schedules and personalize everything. It tends to be an individual activity. A lot of education is really inherently social, but this is something that students typically will do on their own in terms of reviewing their notes. And there are some kind of unique opportunities for us to collect data at scale and continue to improve the content and the quality of the recommendations and scheduling over time.
It also seems like the education system is built on a one-to-many scale, where you have one educator teaching relatively similar content to everyone, while really the best way to learn is a very customized approach, because everyone learns differently. Everyone are at different levels. It sounds like what you're building is a one-to-one type of learning system, where they're literally taking the data of where you're at from a skill level and also how you learn, and then asking you the next questions and providing you with content that's relevant to that individual's learning. Is that correct?
I'd say that's pretty good, but I want to maybe push back a little bit.
Sure.
In that It's more about the flavor of education. This is what one solution might look like. It is very possible to build group experiences that still allow individualized or differentiated outcomes. Great classroom teachers do this all the time, right? They'll have assignments that have kind of a basic level that everyone is expected to meet, but then they'll have some, stretch goals or some, bonus questions that are able to really motivate students who are exploring those further avenues. I think giving students the ability to personalize things for themselves is also something that great classroom teachers do. So I think it would be wrong to say that this is kind of the ideal. I think it's more a sense of this is a practical way of scaling a certain kind of education that maybe hasn't been that possible before.
And you mentioned that it's combining also how the brain works, right? How the brain learns. What did you learn in that research that you applied to Quizizz?
Yeah, so there's been a massive explosion in the amount of neuroscience research that's been happening over the past few decades, combination of cheaper imaging devices, better data processing methodologies, better experimental protocols. So some of the things that we've learned, one is that sleep plays a critical role in memory formation. This is something that maybe intuitively people have known for a while, but in terms of scientific validation, we actually have a much deeper understanding of the mechanisms by which that happens. So one of the things that happens is students don't typically plan ahead, right? Like the I want to study a small amount every day. Students can be told that, but actually getting them to do that and helping them to understand why that's more effective than cramming is where the difficulty of the problem is. So one factor there is that as sleep leads to the consolidation of memories, if you cram for an exam, you'll often forget a large amount of what you studied because it's still in your short-term memory as opposed to lodged in your long-term memory. Another thing that we found from neuroscience is that the connections between neurons can become more stable the more that they're used. So there's this biochemical process called myelination, where the axons connecting your neurons get these sort of protective protein barriers that keep them from degrading. So one of the most effective study strategies is something called spaced repetition. The goal is to review content on kind of increasing intervals that optimally trigger that myelination process. Now, for me to describe at a high level what's happening makes it sound like we have total understanding of what's going on. The reality is we have some kind of principles driven from neuroscience, but then there's a large amount of optimization based on data. So we look at across these thousands of students who studied this particular content, if we randomize when they do their next review, who has the best results, who's most likely to remember it, we incorporate that information into the subsequent recommendations that we make.
And that's where the AI comes in place, right? The data, which is really the machine learning that you're utilizing. So AI has a great place within education. And where would you say that there are positives when it comes to AI in education, and where are maybe the red flags?
Yeah, I like to think that education in some sense is like the best possible application of AI, and in another sense is the worst possible application of AI. Some of the great things about education, right, is that there is potentially a lot of data, right? Like we collect student assessments, homework assignments. There's tons of information about what students know, how they're learning. We can do randomized controlled trials at scale much more effectively using AI-based systems than just having individual teachers, try to tally up what they're doing in their classroom. Education, on the other side, tends to be highly contextual. So there's a ton of noise, right? Students from different socioeconomic or cultural backgrounds respond to pieces of content in different ways. There's a huge motivational piece that undercuts multiple pieces of content. And so in a lot of ways, the game is how do we structure education so that AI is kind of serving and shoring up the things that humans are not necessarily good at, and then make sure that we leverage the things that are working where we need that human connection. Yeah, so in terms of other concerns about AI and education, I think one of the things that's particularly concerning after the advent of LLMs is this shiny new object, right? Like everyone is trying to throw LLMs into their education platform, and it's not always informed by a sound pedagogical theory. Like there's not really thinking around how or why this might be better than what the alternative is. I think the justification is often, maybe we can get grant money or funding if we build this in, or it's more, brandable and exciting, like people want to interact with high-tech tools. But in our haste to add like chat functionality, we're missing out on a lot of less glamorous opportunities to improve things that are maybe much more definite to have an impact. So one of the things I would love to see more of actually is automated grading of free response options. That's one of the biggest, I think, opportunities for large language models to improve educational processes. We've been constrained to using multiple choice questions for so long because they were easy to grade. Now we could theoretically systematize and standardize grading without the need for an army of human graders on free response questions. That's a huge opportunity to ask more natural assessment items, to collect more natural feedback, and even have dialogue-based assessments with students. I've been really encouraged by, for example, the Duolingo English test, which has some kind of AI-graded language items. In education parlance, we always call it an item because it's not always a question. But anyway, if I say item, I'm talking about like something that would be on a quiz. In contrast, there's a ton of companies that have basically thrown a chatbot in their system, but the chatbot is sometimes wrong. The chatbot doesn't know a lot about the student. It's not really being empathetic because, again, it doesn't know much about the student. In some cases, that's actually distracting the student from real human connection or from the content. And so I think, again, going back to the red flags, if there's not a pedagogical theory for why this should be helpful, or if the technology isn't really being applied in a subtle or creative way, my guess is that it's kind of just a jump on the bandwagon of this is the next cool thing.
And what did Quizius do? Like, how did you pivot in the last year? And you mentioned like you're as a company, as a consulting firm, you really focused on this one product. But that product, exactly, how did you pivot within this revolution over the past year and a half? And what are the features? Like, how do those that want to learn utilize it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a rapidly evolving space in my company. So if we have this conversation in 3 months, totally different answers probably.
We'll invite you back in 3 months.
Yeah, sounds great. So, big picture, the pivot was for business reasons. Initially, I was like, I'm going to solve everything. We're going to have content recommendation, personalized review, social like games that engage students in peer-based dialogue. We're going to have mentor recommendation. And then I realized it takes time and money to actually build all that stuff. And I'm a technologist. I'm building a lot of this myself, but I kind of forgot I need to eat in the meantime.
Yeah.
So I got to thinking, like, where's kind of the simplest first place where I can prove out something that we have reason to believe is going to be very impactful? And focusing in on helping law students was kind of a natural application of some of the things we'd been toying around with around personalized review and memorization. So again, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, we kind of focused in on this very specific, here's what we're teaching, here's the main service we're providing. It's a review tool, not an initial instruction tool. Even more specifically, we're very focused on law students have to learn, for example, a lot of case law. And so we help them to memorize summaries of case law, memorize statutes that they have to then apply to new decisions, and we help them to practice for exams by writing out, doing like legal writing. So as far as where we're applying new technologies, as I mentioned, we've got like the prediction of when will they forget. We've got the scheduling optimization. How do we arrange students' content so that they can use it most effectively? We've got some automated feedback mechanisms to identify when content might be actually counterproductive. And then we are using large language models for some things like semantic search. So if a student is looking for existing content or content that they've written and they don't remember exactly the keywords that they used, they can put something that's approximately correct, and we're able to find the content that's most closely related. Another tool that or another way that we're using it is to help students to generate good questions based on documents.
Oh, that's great, Sam. What I like about it is how you used an MVP model, right? A most viable product. And when you do that, you're allowed to be very focused, to really zero in on what works, what not. Because if you try to do everything for all, you're most likely not even going to be able to ever complete it. And like you said, you've got a couple of children, you need to put food on the table. You need to really focus on one segment. So that's a really smart business model idea that you did. What's one thing that you have learned from being very focused into a niche, essentially, and where do you want to go from here? Do you feel like you can scale this to different markets, so to speak?
Yeah, so I think I'll answer those parts in reverse order. Scalability has always been a major goal. I don't want to end up painting myself into a corner and this is the only thing I do. So I think there is a definite capacity for the technology to apply to other kinds of content. Some of the things that we've had to do to tailor the platform and the content are really getting a deep understanding of what people are using it to study and how they think about the studying process. One of the things that I've had to learn is that in all of the reading that I've done on different studying processes, the neurological effects that contribute to memory formation, like all of this, I have a very clear picture in my head of what needs to happen for someone to learn something. But students show up on the platform and they're like, I want to do this kind of studying. Like, I just want to review notes from this one class. And I'm like, well, the research says that interleaved practice is more effective. But I can't get in an argument with every one of my customers. So I need to figure out, how can I build this platform so that they naturally do the thing that's most helpful for them. That's been a huge amount of the customization, is working with our beta testers, doing interviews and walkthroughs as they're using the product, and trying to really understand what are they trying to accomplish and how can we better serve them on that journey. As an example with law, they want to learn case law examples and are not experts at writing assessment items. So one of the places that we had to iterate the most was actually on the tooling that we provide to help them build a sort of studyable flashcards from the content in their notes. That was a surprisingly difficult translation to make, and we wound up building a lot of tooling around doing that quickly and effectively.
When it comes to entrepreneurship, AI, and education, you are all three, right? You are an entrepreneur with this focus on AI and education. What would you say to future entrepreneurs that want to get in this AI and education space? Like, what advice would you have for them? Because it seems like you've learned a lot through the way. You were also a student in a way, as you were always learning. So you have a good holistic viewpoint. What would you say to those that want to get into this space today?
Oh man, if only I knew, 8 years ago what I know now. This is a difficult, thing for me to answer, because I think I've become keenly aware of how much I don't know. That's been a large part of the progress over the last few months, has been figuring out what are the things that I need to learn or test or experiment with. I think some high-level pieces of advice. One is that you can't go into education technology only as an educator or only as a technologist. I see a lot of educators coming in trying to replicate what has worked in a classroom, but that was strongly informed by the constraints of the classroom. And there are things that are difficult to scale beyond the classroom because there are different constraints when you get to technology. Conversely, I think sometimes there are opportunities to automate things that educators are blind to, because there are just like ways of life, right? Like, this is how we do grading. GPA is a thing. You get to a platform and it's like, why do we need to reduce it all to one number? We could track every single thing that a student knows. That's a big mind shift for most educators. On the technology side, I see a lot of people coming in who think that education boils down to a student watches some YouTube videos, answers a quiz, and then they know the topic. And they're missing out on, first of all, that doesn't work for an enormous number of practical skills, right? Like, you want to learn a musical instrument. You can't learn that just by watching videos. You have to actually practice. Never mind, trades and other high-skill professions. There are lots of things that can't be easily digitized. And then even beyond that, there's a lot of nuance to learning that goes beyond exposure to content and answering quizzes. So you definitely need both. And then entrepreneurship is super hard. I think a lot of entrepreneurs either start because they want to make a company or because they want to have an impact on the world. I think the ones who start wanting to make a company actually have an easier time of it because they're willing to change what the company is in order to make it happen. I think if you go into it with a vision, then you find yourself trying to navigate this narrow space of how do I not compromise my end vision, but also do something that is sustainable and can grow. One of the best, pieces of advice that I've learned as an entrepreneur is that iteration is inevitable. And if you stop thinking about it as I need to build the perfect company and then launch it, and instead think about it as I'm going to try something this week and I'm going to try something different next week. And if I keep trying something different, by the time I've done 50 different things, I may have found something that works.
Which is similar to how AI models are built, right? And you fine-tune models, it's all about that iteration.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. In machine learning, we have this formal theorem that describes something called the bias variance trade-off. And basically, it says that if you don't make assumptions, then you need more data. And the problem with assumptions, of course, is that they can be wrong, but data is expensive. And the fewer assumptions you make, the more data you need. And so as a machine learning researcher, but also as an entrepreneur, I think there's this trade-off between I have some idea about how the market works. I have an idea about how a company could work if it's deployed in this space. And I need to make some assumptions. And the hard thing is trying to make them the right ones and then test everything else.
Sam, it seems like out of the two paths that you talked about for entrepreneurship, you kind of lean towards the visionary part where you had a vision and you built the company based on that. Would you say that's pretty accurate?
That's definitely an accurate classification. I've had to learn the other side. How do I actually make it work today? Definitely that's been the biggest struggle of my journey.
And you're iterating, you're evolving. I mean, you're evolving already in the past 4 months. So to ask you what is Quizzius like in the future is probably tough to answer. So maybe not thinking 5-10 years down the road, but what about, let's say, in the next 12 months? Where do you see Quizzius heading?
Yeah, so I think from a business point of view, there's some very obvious low-hanging fruit. We want to expand our usership among first-year law students, hoping for a few % market share by the end of the year, see if it happens. In terms of the product itself, there are definite ways that we can scale kind of vertically along the law student's journey. So I think we could end up servicing pre-law students and also servicing graduates who are, for example, studying for the bar. From a business point of view, that makes a lot of sense. There's some overlap in content and infrastructure and distribution channels. In terms of where I would like this to go after that, again, a lot of the iteration is around the core features that we already have. One of my many hobbies is game design. And I've actually done a fair amount of academic reading on design of gameplay mechanics. There's a word used in education, gamification, which I actually don't like because a lot of times it's taking something that's not a game and throwing a point system on it and then calling it a game and kind of missing out on how is the user granted new agency and how does that reward their effort and creativity? How do we create this sort of learning cycle of something that is a learning experience in its own right? And so one of the things we built into Quizzius is this loop where the more that students review, the more points they earn to unlock new content, which they can then review. And the users are able to select what content it is. They can upload their own content. There's lots of flexibility there. But this was a key way that we were trying to tackle the problem of how do we keep students from trying to cram? If they can't unlock enough content quickly enough, then they're going to realize an incremental strategy is going to be more effective.
That's smart.
So a lot of the iteration that I'd like to see over the next 12 months is really just refining that core mechanic so that, again, we can incentivize students to do the things that are actually most helpful for them in a way that's kind of understandable and visceral. For them. They shouldn't need to be educated about neuroscience to feel like they want to study a certain amount every day. Beyond that, we're very interested in expanding into other areas where Quizzius is a good fit. So med students have a ton of memorizable content. We probably won't touch language learning for a while. Duolingo has kind of got that wrapped up right now. And then after that, I actually think there's a large amount of potential in high leverage STEM fields. So we've done some experiments with computer science education, math, engineering. There's some work we have to do to adapt the kinds of questions that we can ask, but I think there's a lot of potential to make those kinds of learning experiences a lot more efficient. And then after that, I've got tons of plans, but that's the 1 to 2 year horizon.
That's very cool. It makes me think about how a lot of our audience knows that I've been advocating, and we finally have an AI task force for the state of Rhode Island, right, with the Governor McKee. And I'll be on that task force, and one of our key pillars is education, from K through 12 in higher ed, but also workforce development. And as you're talking, especially the last part when you're talking about STEM, I can see how this can be applied either through, let's say, K through 12 in higher ed, or for workforce development, because as IBM stated, there's going to be a massive 40 to 60% of jobs that need to be upskilled, reskilled. So there's going to be some type of mechanism that helps educate these adults that have to learn new skills for the new AI economy. So kind of knowing that I'm going to be involved in this task force, I'm going to have to report some good ideas. Do you have any good ideas for me on how I can propose how the state of Rhode Island, our students, and the workforce, how can they use something maybe like Quizius to upskill, reskill, and learn these new skills for this new AI economy?
How much time have you got? I have a lot of opinions. I wrote a whole book of my opinions, so I'll just give some of the low-hanging fruit here. I think the first is that the division between K-12 and professional learning, upskilling, is artificial, right? Like, what is the purpose of education if the next generation is not able to feed themselves? That's not to say that there aren't other kinds of education that need to happen in the classroom, but I think if we don't have an eye towards economic sustainability, when we think about the curriculum in K-12 and even higher education, then we're definitely missing the mark. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I would suggest, it isn't really using AI per se, but I'd consider revising a curriculum that brings more focus to employability and skills that are relevant to the economic growth.
Transferable skills.
Yeah, that's a big piece of it. I think there's a lot of things that we don't teach well, like interpersonal skills, right? We sort of expect like, oh, they'll learn that in sports, or they'll learn that from talking to their friends. But this is actually most of the work that we do, right, in any organization, is cooperating as a team. Expecting students to figure that out on their own, when that's probably the number one skill that will translate between different contexts, is, again, it's missing the mark. We've gotten in the habit of teaching what's easy or what we've done in the past, rather than thinking about how can we teach the things that are hard but really valuable.
That's a great point.
A second thing is I think we really need to reconsider what the endpoint is of a lot of the standard subjects that we already teach. As an example, the math sequence, traditionally pre-calculus and calculus are sort of the high points in a high school math curriculum. But the reality is, if you're not going into the physical sciences, those are way less useful than an understanding of statistics. And I think AI and machine learning has probably magnified that. Ironically, machine learning does use calculus in order to optimize a lot of the statistical models.
Finally, calculus is actually utilized.
Yeah, but the fact is, like, and if we think about misinformation, we think about all of the kinds of societal issues that we'll be faced with, statistics is a much better endpoint for the math curriculum. For English, there's it cuts both ways in that the reality is students learn no matter what they're reading. Pleasure reading is a huge predictor of academic success. At the same time, there's some things like a personal narrative is probably not as helpful to learn how to write compared to, say, business emails, technical communication, again, these interpersonal skills. And I don't know how many organizations I've gone into, right? They have documentation, they have guidebooks. Those were written by someone who maybe wasn't trained to write those things. They just happened to be the person in charge of it. If we had more emphasis on professionally relevant writing and communication. And then news and misinformation. That's another thing that I would love to see more emphasis on in English curriculum. It's easy for me to say that because I don't teach English. I can just throw stones as much as I want. There are actually a lot of great educators who are already doing those things. Third thing is I would explicitly bring more computing education into the curriculum. I think that every student should have a basic understanding of how software works, meaning mechanically, how does programming work, where does software come from. They don't necessarily have to go into computer science, but I think at this point it's sort of a required literacy to be able to cut through the hype and the noise around emerging technologies and build realistic expectations for what they can and can't do. Cybersecurity concerns are another thing that it's very difficult to appreciate or understand without at least some basic understanding of how computer science works. And I also think that basic literacy in AI and machine learning is something that more students should be exposed to. Last thing, maybe, is, I think, there's a lot of tension in education because we're not all on the same page about what it's for. These are not new debates. Is education for individual enrichment? Is it for promoting a democratic society? Is it for the economic growth of the country? There are trade-offs that we have to make depending on what we think it's for. But I think it's a little bit ironic that in society, right, our value often comes from diversification and specialization, right? The fact that you and I have different expertise makes us more valuable to each other.
Right.
Whereas in a K-12 setting, it's like you're all going to learn the same thing. You're all going to be tested on the same thing. You're all going to be tested the same way. If anyone doesn't conform to this image of the ideal student, then you're just less valuable than the straight A-plussers. And then those students, the A-plussers, they go off to college. Everyone else has got to figure it out. And then 5 years later, they're like, what was up with school? I'm doing great. I have a real job. I'm doing, this high value trade. In some cases, I think this is one of the biggest things I would change is just this perception of the trades, right? There's incredibly valuable work that no one is doing because we as a society are if you don't go to college, it's just not as good. And that's not true, right? People can do incredibly valuable work individually and of great importance to our society without having to pursue, a liberal arts education. Anyway, I think that, my final, if I could get everything on this bucket list passed, it would be that we should really think about how to structure education so that the endpoints are not all the same for students and that there's some more opportunity for diversification and specialization of students across different disciplines and endpoints.
I mean, that was well said. I'm literally going to re-listen to my own episode right here before I go into this AI task force meeting when we talk about education, because you bring up a lot of great points. Not everything was related to even artificial intelligence, right? I mean, obviously having a basic sense of programming, some of that in preparing the skills that we're going to need. But when it comes to education as a whole, right, those were really great points. And someone that wrote a book, one of my last questions is, you wrote, it's called Education the Next 100 Years. What does education look like over the next century?
Yeah, so I do want to preface this. I believed everything I wrote in the book when I wrote it, but I very much feel like I need to update the book. There's been a lot.
When did you publish the book?
Let's see, 2019, I think. Okay. So it's been about 5 years. So the premise of the book is that in order for something to last, it has to be sustainable, right? If something includes ingredients that make it inherently unsustainable, it's just not going to be around in 100 years. We'll have something different, probably something that is sustainable. What makes sustainable education? Well, it has to be economically feasible. So the amount that we're putting into the education has to be less than the amount that we get back as a consequence. That's been true for most of the history of public education, and even a small fraction of that collected through tax revenue is able to fund public education for the next generation. But I think as the things that we're learning have kind of drifted further and further from what's economically relevant, we are going to see that tension come into sharp contrast. One of the places this shows up is in teacher compensation. Teachers are incredibly undercompensated for relative to their expertise, right? They're all college educated. Many of them have master's degrees. Some of them have discipline-specific knowledge. It's very hard to find qualified physics teachers, qualified computer science teachers, because these people who have physics or computer science degrees can go off and earn 2 or 3 times as much in industry. So we need to think more about how can we build an education system that's economically sustainable? I think that's true in the U.S. I'm even more thinking like globally. How do we scale education that we know is valuable in areas where historically it hasn't been easy to capture and recycle that value to the next generation? The second thing is that education has to be societally sustainable, right? Like we have to operate within the political landscape and ecosystem that the education system is a part of. There are a ton of programs that get shut down because they were unpopular with the wrong person before they had a chance to really have a large impact. So thinking about education in 100 years, I think a lot of things that aren't constrained by those two things are going to change. One of the biggest changes that I foresee is that the role of teachers is going to change dramatically. Right now, teachers in a classroom, they're managers, they are coaches, they are mentors, and they are pedagogists, right? Like they need to know the content, they need to help students to navigate their academic careers, they need to motivate students, they need to keep students accountable for doing their assignments. I think in the future, those aren't all going to be the same person. In particular, I think there's been an emergence of really high-quality pedagogy on like social media and self-publishing platforms. I think about public science communicators on like YouTube and other places where they're doing this really high-quality work, communicating really profound ideas, but they don't get compensated by the education system for that. They get paid by ad revenue off of YouTube, which pushes them to be, entertaining as opposed to being educationally effective. The education industry is incredibly inefficient in terms of rewarding academic progress and improvements to the infrastructure of education. So I see in 100 years, these 4 different roles could actually be different people. We might have skilled pedagogists who are inventing new ways of teaching, who are getting compensated at the level of rock stars, right? Like you put out a hit album, I came out with a hit way of teaching fractions. And then mentors may actually get closer to the age of the students. I think there's a lot of really great research on near-peer mentorship and near-peer relationships in education and helping a student to kind of navigate their academic journey and to understand and connect the dots. How does this lead to where I want to go? In a lot of ways actually requires a number of different people. Asking one classroom teacher to be that for all of their students is just too much. I think we can do better with kind of a panel of mentors and advisors who get dynamically connected, but they're not then solely responsible for that student. There are other people in the cohort as well. It's like it takes a village. And then coaches, people who are like facilitating learning, helping students to engage, stay motivated. That's almost like a separate role altogether. You might have an academic advisor or a facilitator of different content, but they are more focused on, are you moving through the content, and less focused on what is the content that's being taught. And then managers, I think a lot of that, like no human that I've met loves grading, right? Like they might like giving feedback to the students, but no one's sitting down like, man, I just can't wait to grade these 200 multiple choice items from 20 different students, right? Like those are things that we can outsource to AI. And I think there's also a degree of fairness to that, right? Like things are automated, students can get feedback faster, it's hopefully impartial. So I think in 100 years, the infrastructure of school, like what the schedule looks like, how many people you interact with, is actually going to look really different, even though a lot of the pieces will still be there. I also think what we teach will be different. I think what students are trying to do will be different. I think students will be more engaged in the real world while they're also being educated. Some of this is just wishful thinking, but if I were in charge of what we had 100 years from now, that's what I would try to build.
Well, that sounds great, Sam. We'll have to interview you in 100 years on the AI Way podcast and see what the future of education is like. Well, thank you for joining us. I know a lot of our folks have learned just like I have. If they want to know where they can find more information or reach out to you, how can they learn more?
Yeah, the most reliable way to connect with me is on LinkedIn, Sam Saarinen, that's Saarinen, just like the architect, probably no relation. Anyway, connect with me on LinkedIn.
That's great. Well, thanks again for hopping on, and look forward to staying on top of what you're doing with Quizzes and everything else that you got going on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris.
Thanks.